cold metal tang rode the Rivendell air as Geralt of Rivia stepped from a pale rift into elven firelight. The world brightened and narrowed at once. Smoke braided like silver thread, cups clinked, voices wove a slow, distant song. He had walked through war and winter, his skin still remembered the chill of steel and the taste of old iron. Here, for a breath, those memories lay quiet, beneath a clean, impossible calm. His silver sword thudded against his hip and hummed faintly, a note only he could hear. It was an instrument and a warning. His hand, scarred and sure, tasted the salt of other battles on its own skin, as if older fights left their ghosts in the marrow. Elven light painted his face in colors that made the world seem a dream the dreamer had not consented to. Pipe smoke curled like question marks under the rafters. Somewhere to his left, an unbroken melody threaded through the hall, a voice without age. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, concealed things Geralt's senses told him were listening. He felt the scrape of malice as one feels a cold draft along a bone. Not much now, barely a bruise, but present as a bruise before it blooms. There was also another sound, singular and sharp, that set his teeth on edge, an object that sang like a wound. It did not scream. It pulsed with a slow, persistent ache, calling at the edge of his attention with a voice only those taught to hear could name. Gandalf the Grey watched him from beneath a curl of shadow and candlelight, a tall shape wrapped in gray whose presence felt like counsel and calculation. The wizard's eyes were small fires, steady and silver. They took measure as one might test a blade by the temper of a flame. He did not rise to greet Geralt in the manner of common courtesy. Instead, he held his peace, and the stillness between them said more than any bow could. Beside Gandalf, a hobbit sat with a trembling that seemed greater than his size. Frodo's hands were folded around something unseen, knuckles white as river stones. The Witcher nodded once, a flat motion that meant he had come for reason and would not be swayed by prettiness. Geralt smelled the burden on the hobbit like one might smell perfume that hides rot. The scent was subtle, a sweetness that clung to the skin, an odor in which every pleasant thing drowned as though the scent itself were a lie. He had hunted curses and brood-sworn beasts. This stench was new, a moral rot that made the hairs at the nape of his neck stand up. It tugged at him in a manner unlike the cries of monsters. Where a fiend's presence announced itself with the smell of damp fur and stale hunger, this thing was civil, patient as a spider weaving silk. He did not name it aloud. He did not need to. Men and wizards had names enough for power. The Witcher only needed to know whether it hurt or made him hurt others. The Fellowship offered purpose before it offered promise. Men and elves, dwarves and hobbits, a ranger of distant lands, and a prince of seaborne memory. They gathered not as a court, but as a council in which danger sat at the head. Their faces were mapped by worry and hope alike. When the word fellowship passed between them, it did so as an instrument that might be bent to many uses. Geralt, who had learned to measure contracts in coin and consequence, read in their arrangement something harsher. They needed more than guidance. They needed someone who understood killing when killing would undo harm. They needed a hand that would not flinch when met with malice, a blade that could be trusted to fall when mercy would leave wounds festering. He accepted because that was how his life had shaped him, not out of kinship with quests, nor out of sudden love for hobbits and lore. He came for the thing that sang like a wound and because the promise made to protect a life suited his craft better than any gold. His vow was quick, made of blunt words and a hold-fast look. He would, he said, keep the bearer from harm. He would fight. He would die, if need be. The words were simple, the meaning less so. Witchers take contracts for killing. They learn to value ends in a currency of survival. To guard a soul from corruption was a different trade. It asked for patience where he had been taught immediacy. It demanded restraint from a man whose reflex was to answer poison with a blade. Gandalf spoke then, voice slow and full as a bell. None would say the wizard coaxed him, but neither did he refuse outright. The old man's counsel was a map not of roads, but of necessity. He named dangers not as distant tales, but as weather. He told of shadow and of riders that came from the east, of things that did not sleep because death had failed to be its end. Geralt listened and found in those descriptions familiar patterns. Predators bided their time until hunger caught up with them. Corruption behaved like a predator that preferred to starve a mind slowly. The Witcher had tools for both. He had tinctures and potions that sharpened nerve and dulled pain, poisons to fell beasts, and a mind that judged motive like a hunter reads footprints. But he had never been asked to guard a hope. Frodo's eyes found him at the end of that speech, and for a flicker, the hobbit's fear was a crack in a thin shell. He was small and fragile, and yet held something that made even Gandalf's hair darken. Geralt felt an odd kinship with that frailty, perhaps, because both of them had been marked by journeys not chosen. He approached without ceremony. Where others offered counsel, Geralt offered a gesture more truthful to his nature. A warm, weathered hand placed over the small one, steadying, not because he promised gentleness, but because he promised bluntness, to stand in the face of harm and break its mouth. The hobbit exhaled as if relief were a physical thing that left his ribs at that moment. It was not salvation, but it was immediate. It could be bought with sweat and steel. Yet the Witcher's code sat uneasy in the council's hall, like an animal that presses its nose to a threshold. He had rules born of killing things. Strike true, do not hesitate, never trade tomorrow for the comfort of the present. Those rules had teeth and had kept him alive. They also made him cruel in the currency of hearts. To protect a life against an invisible rot required more than evisceration of the nearest threat. It required patience. It required the restraint of not cutting, when a cut would reveal something worse. His medallion, a small iron face that thrummed at any magic's whisper, shivered now with a different kind of chill. Magic here did not roar, but insinuated. The instrument at his throat fluttered like a bird uncertain of what sky to trust. Outside Rivendell, the river sang the way rivers do, as if the world could flow away from worry. But within the hall, a map of the road unfolded. Mountains, passes, a choice of peril. The fellowship would depart with the first lean of dusk. Geralt watched faces, a prince's jaw, an elf's unblinking composure, a dwarf's compact strength, and he filed them into considerations. Allies are calculations as much as companions' weight and edges and habits matter. He fastened his swords with motions that had the economy of old habits. The silver looked almost alien here, gleaming by candlelight like a thing at odds with gentleness. Yet he was resolved to use it as necessary. There were small private things he did not say aloud. The way he tested blades by drawing them in the quiet of the night, the slow breathing exercises that tempered fear into focus, the way he could read the color of candle wax to tell how the room had been warmed and how long. These were craftsman's secrets, the same meticulousness he would now apply to a task that had nothing to do with coin. He laid out a few elixirs onto a makeshift table, ointments and dried herbs whose names he did not speak, for some truths are only useful when practical. He tasted one by fingertip and found it bitter in the way that tells you it will save you, but perhaps at a cost. He thought of the tune the object carried and tasted a note of iron on that bitterness. When night stepped fully into the valley and the stars hung clean and judgmental, they spoke of a beginning. They spoke not as poets, but as those who had read maps until ink bled into lore. Geralt accepted the place allotted him without vanity. He would walk among them, strange and blunt and necessary. He would be the shield that took slashes meant for a hobbit's small shoulders. He would test whether killing could blunt corruption, whether brute skill could temper more subtle poison. His vow would be tested on the road. He knew it always is. Roads teach lessons in a hard dialect. Before they rose to leave, Gandalf caught his arm with a touch that was not light. "There are things," the wizard said, voice like dry leaves, "that will not fall under steel alone." The words were not a rebuke, but an order and a caution braided together. Geralt nodded, acknowledgement rather than agreement. He had seen curses that laughter could unmake, and he had seen beasts that prayer could not bind. This was new. He understood the possibility of failure as keenly as he understood the possibility of success. Between them moved plans and doubts like coiled ropes. They would go at dawn. Pack animals would be saddled, paths would be chosen and argued. Frodo, with that small singing thing hidden from common sight, would be shadowed by men and elves, and by one witcher whose hands were rougher than most, whose eyes were colder than some. He felt a small private satisfaction in the steadiness of his own heartbeat. It meant he was ready in the way of those who will not flinch. Yet, as he strapped his satchel and laid a hand on the pommel of his sword, he also felt the fine thread of unease, a sense that the road would demand not only his blade, but a kind of mercy that had never been taught in his school. Outside, mist rolled like the beginning of something deliberate. Inside, the fellowship gathered to depart. Geralt set his face to the coming day, to the mountains and the unknowns they bore. He had come to cut down monsters and tall tales. Now he would be asked, whether one can cut away a fate without letting one's hands become stained by the thing one seeks to remove. He stepped toward the door with the rest, and the cold from the valley touched his skin as if testing where his loyalties began. He would keep his promise for now. That was an intention. He would keep it in the only way he knew how, by being first where danger breathed and last where hope needed guarding. The road before them lifted and narrowed into a throat of stone, and the fellowship moved into it like a single, uncertain heartbeat. The road narrowed to a throat between low hills, and the air grew thin and metallic beneath a pale, hard sun. Horses picked their way on gravel that whispered like old coins. Men and hobbits moved with the slow, cautious economy of those who carry more than food in their packs. Geralt walked at the flank of Frodo's mule, his hand on a saddle leather as if to steady himself against something the eye could not see. He smelled the trail as hunters smell a change in the wind. No herbs, no open rot, but a cold, undercut sweetness that coated the tongue and left a metallic spore on the back of the throat. To him, The ring did not glimmer, it tasted and breathed, a living sickness that lay along the earth like frost. Aragorn watched him with an old, patient caution. "You call it a scent," he said. "Yet in my years, I have learned more of shadow by watching its shape than by smelling it." His voice was low, a river that had learned to carry stones. "We cannot hunt a thing that is not wholly of our world. If you mean to track its spoor, Geralt of Rivia, be sure you will not lead us into snares of thought." Boromir's laugh was short and like a blade struck on a shield. He had ridden hard these last days, the heat building behind his ears, and the thought of a power that could tip battles was a constant ember. "Snares of thought," he repeated, his tone full of wounded pride, "or excuses. We would do well to guard the ring, to set watch and march slow. Power can be used as a sword. You, stranger, would go hunting ghosts while men die." Geralt's reply was neither harsh nor pleading. He smelt of sage and iron, of bottled verminbane, and the resinous tang of wolfsbane. "A wound that festers will kill more men than one blade," he said. "The ring does not simply sit upon fingers and await orders. It seeks those weak of will, it whispers to fearful hearts and cuts out like a disease. If it has taken root near here, men at arms will be its first feast. We do not have time for parlor watchfires." The argument was not new to those who had gathered the air between them, filled with the old tensions of war, honor and caution, hunger and sacrifice. Others listened without speaking. The hobbits pulsed with quiet fear and an ocean-deep trust in their small companion. Gandalf, if he walked beside them, had already learned to weigh each voice as one weighs wind. He permitted Geralt to demonstrate. They camped for the night in a hollow where the grass grew in rings, the kind of place that held stories like the shapes of old bones. Geralt prepared quietly, setting out bottles under a blanket of wool and drawing runes in the dirt with a knife whose blade had been rubbed with salt and silver. Aragorn and Boromir paced the edge of the firelight, each speaking in brief sentences, their debate no longer only about tactics, but about what it meant to wield power at all. The hobbits slept in a tangle of blankets, oblivious and trusting. The stars were sharp, the hills pressed about them with watching faces. Geralt's methods were small and precise. He ground a leaf into a cup of water and tasted it, then shut his eyes as if listening to the water. He threw a sign into the air, a thin, visible tremor that crouched like a quiet animal, and the flame of the camp answered by flaring blue for a breath. The Witcher's crafts are not grand, they are surgical. The blue flame did not last, but its briefness was an argument. The ring's scent, he showed them, responded to certain disturbances, recoiled from light in particular ways, and sought shadowed cloth and hidden seams as a moth seeks a warm crease. It will crawl toward thought as a moth to light, Geralt said, but only when minds are open and fear feeds it. I can make it show its trail if we force its hand. Boromir stepped close, hand on the hilt of his sword. Force its hand, or place yourself within reach, he warned. We cannot have a stranger play surgeon with a wound that might yet be cut from our people. Aragorn's answer was a soft, decisive thing. We have come this far because we have balanced each other, he said. We will not cordon ourselves away like monks with a relic. We will act, and we will protect. If Geralt can take us to the root, he will not go alone. So they moved as one the next day, but with a new purpose. They did not stride as a procession around a relic. They threaded the road like a hunting pack, Aragorn keeping the lead and Geralt sweeping the flanks. Boromir trod closest to the hobbit with the ring, his eyes never leaving the small face that carried such weight. Gimli and Legolas were quiet as stones and wind, each watched with the trained gaze of their folk. Their march bent like a reed toward a place where the land sloped and folded, where stones lay like the teeth of something old, buried just beneath the soil. It was there, on a stretch of ground, where old cairns had been turned and the air had the faint odor of smoke long gone, that Geralt halted. He crouched and drew a circle in the dust, and the circle drank the light. He traced a line with his thumb, and the white dust that had clung to his glove caught like a pale hair along the furrow. Aragorn came close, bending as if to read a script. Boromir closed the last few paces with the impatient stamp of a man uncertain whether to obey command or command obedience. Geralt tapped the ground with the haft of his sword. "It moves in layers," he said. "First, a warmth that draws breath, then a thinning, like a breath being stolen. Here." He pointed to the fingerprint smear on a stone. It leaned against the rock for a while. Not the ring-bearer alone. Something else passed through. Something older, a wight? Legolas asked, his voice like a flute to the dusk. He had seen the Barrow Downs in memory, and in tale his ears twitched at the word. Gimli spat soft in disdain. "If it is bone, it will be hard to break," he said. "But it will give us coin." Geralt had not spoken the word barrow, yet the shape of the trail drew them like breath to blood. The ground took a dip and then rose again in a small, unremarked mound. Stones had been set as if to mark a tomb that no hand cared for any longer. Around it the grass leaned inward, as if the very earth listened. "Stay 2 parts watch to 1 part movement," Aragorn ordered. "If there is an old place of power here, we will not be careless." They cut a ring of fire and set watchers. Geralt sat with his back to a rock, eyes closed, and the taste of the air sharpened in his mouth. He muttered quietly, a language not Elvish nor Western, and ran a sigil on his palm with iron. He drank a potion that smelled faintly of root and copper, and set his senses to a hearing the rest did not share. It was as if he slid a pane of glass between the world and himself, and the glass trembled with little things, the heartbeat of a fox, the sigh of a man in his sleep, the deeper, slower thud that might be an old thing, dreaming. They did not wait long. A sound came from under the mound first as a tiny dry shift, as if bones rearranged themselves like stones settling. The air cooled, a murkiness pooled toward the grass and blotted the firelight. Shadows are not always absence of light in that country. They are intent, given shape. From the mound came a whisper that was not speech, but the sound of lost names on the wind. It tasted of iron. Boromir's blade sprang free. Aragorn's hands were already moving, fingers finding old knots and old sigils. Geralt opened his eyes. The world beyond the ring flame for a single breath looked wrong. Edges sharpened into bladed ink. Colors leached into a pale that made the blood in their veins look foreign. He inhaled deep and caught the ring scent braided with something far older, an old hunger that had been waiting and taking patience. Geralt stood, the potion warming his chest like a coal. "It knows we are here," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried to every ear, and it has called what sleeps. From the shadows came a figure, not wholly whole. It was a shape that might have once worn mail, the shadow of a man whose metal had turned to rust and thought itself a crown. But across the air around it, thin threads of a different thing fluttered, gleams like torn silver veils that clung to seams of cloth, and whispered to the small stirrings of will. They moved with the speed of thought. Aragorn stepped forward, but Geralt was not slow to follow. He did not draw steel in the manner of men. He shaped a sign between clenched fingers, and the world seemed to hiccup. The creature recoiled as if burned, and a sound like a folded bell broke from its loosened throat. Boromir lunged, and his blade found air where flesh might have been. The thing dissolved in a spray of dust and stale blood smell, but the threads of influence did not vanish. One braided itself toward Frodo like a greedy spider. Frodo cried out, a small, clear sound that opened the night. The thread that reached for him was only a wisp, but it tasted of small boyhoods and promises kept, and the weight of years. Boromir's hand closed on the hilt of his sword. All at once his face changed. The hunger that had been a political ache and a soldier's greed showed itself pure and quick. Aragorn's hand moved to steady Boromir's shoulder with the gentle strength of a steward. Geralt's voice cut through, dry and iron-willed. Not to touch, to cut. Draw lines of salt and iron and keep watch on thoughts. We fight it like a beast, not like a relic. He said it as if reciting a map. Let the ring not lead our hands. For an instant, the camp became two worlds at once, the one of men and hobbits, and the one of the thing beneath the mound that hungrily unspooled its old cunning. The hunters and the guardians stood shoulder to shoulder, and the night itself seemed to hold its breath. Legolas loosed an arrow with a soft whisper. It found nothing but a raveling thread. Gimli hurled an axe, and the blow hammered at a place that felt like a memory rather than a body. "What will you do?" Boromir demanded, his voice rough with a hunger that was not solely his. "If you refuse to let us guard it, how will you keep us from being fenced by willpower and shadow?" Geralt did not answer with rhetoric. He bent, took a strip of cloth from his belt, and offered it to Frodo. "Tie a knot for yourself," he said. "Make a thing your own, and do not let another make it a god. If you must carry it, carry with eyes open." The ring-bearer did what he was told. The hobbit's fingers were small, shaking, but he tied the knot and looked up with a face like a small moon. The bell of will in him tempered the thread's pull. Boromir watched. Every line of his face knotted with the cost of restraint. Aragorn's hand rested on Frodo's shoulder, not ownership but steadiness, and the steadiness was like a bridge. This was the choice, made not with argument but with living craft, to hunt the influence where it ran, to strike at the roots, and yet to hold the ring-bearer close and teach him the small protections of habit and knotwork and thought. They would not carry the ring as a relic under wraps. They would carry it as a charged wound that needed tending. The mound shuddered as if in anger, and from it crawled more threads, less substantial, but more cunning. A whisper reached Geralt like the smell of metal heated and then cooled. He read it like a ledger, a name half remembered, a road where travelers had lost their sense, and beneath that, an old door that had been opened once and never properly closed. The place the trail pointed to was not distant. It lay to the west, where the ground pooled low and the trees made a dark cup. Aragorn looked at the band around the fire, faces lit by a wavering orange, eyes set in lines that spoke of duty, hunger, fear, and a new reluctant faith in the witcher's craft. "Then we go," he said simply. "We hunt the scent and guard the bearer. We split our vigilance into teeth and shield." Geralt nodded, not with triumph, but with the cool acceptance of one who knows the stakes. He drew a poultice from his pack, rubbed it on the backs of his hands, and fixed his silvered blade upon his hip. The thing he tracked had drawn itself a map of hunger into the world. The kings and wanderers and small folk would walk that map with him. They would be both predators and guardians by turns. They broke camp with a swift, efficient grace. The hobbits were bundled and led between two men. Boromir walked beside the ring-bearer, and though his look was hungry, his hands were steady. Aragorn took the lead. Geralt moved as a shadow of his own, listening to the wind as if it were a language. The road ahead dipped into a hollow that tasted, even in that last breath of light, of old hunger and older promises. The mound they had left was like an unfinished sentence. At the lip of the hollow, where the grass thinned and the stones made a ring, Geralt paused and sniffed. The scent swelled, a complex of iron and cold, and something like a child's lullaby turned sour. "That way," he said. His voice carried a warning and an invitation together. "The shadow knows the route already. We go, and we do not walk it like a pilgrimage. We flush it." He set his boots to the slope, and the rest followed. Their steps fell into a new rhythm, kept and keen, toward the place where the shadows had waited and where, now, they were waking. The sky above the pass went black as if a curtain had been drawn across the stars. Under it came a sound like a great bell muffled and smashed, the beating of immense wings, and the air tasted of cold iron and old smoke. Wild firelight flamed in the hollows where the Nazgul moved, little bursts of green and blue that made the shadows deepen rather than dispel. They fell like storms, not like men, and the world drew back from them with a soft, fearful sound. Boots that stopped, a child's breath held in some throat. Geralt heard these things with the sense that he had earned from a long life of listening. The crack of splintering wood, the rasp of cloth over bone, the tiny click of a hidden dagger sliding free. He did not wait for commands. He had no time for counsels or prayers. The Witcher's signs are quick as thought and cruel in their economy. He traced with a forefinger that had slashed stags and scripted runes upon his skin the circle of Yrden upon the ground. The sign took no shape of words. It nested in the air like frost, a pale ring that smelled faintly of ozone and old apples, that hummed with a cunning light. It was not much to look at, but what it did, what witchcraft could do in the teeth of things not born of earth, was enough to slow a thing that has no bone and will. A Nazgul came closest, a spear of darkness that slid down from the sky with a sound like many locks opening. Geralt threw himself between its path and the hobbit who staggered at the edge of the lane. Steel sang, "Where iron touches shadow, there is a different law, a burning touch that remembers sunlight." Geralt's blade found purchase as if it struck water. The Nazgul recoiled with a sound like dry leaves tearing. For a moment, the wraith wavered, an eddy of night unthreading around the Witcher's sword. He felt the blade bite, felt the cold that was hunger hiss back at him. But fate is not a thing that can be split by a single strike. Another stroke, a thin and shining thing from a horseman veiled in night, slipped past flesh and armor and sought smaller blood. The Morgul blade came like a whisper of glass. It found Frodo where he stood, pale and turning, his fingers clutching at the leather of his belt as though to hold himself together. The blade did not cut so much as pour into him cold and song. There was a sound in the air like breaking ice, and Frodo's face went thin as paper. Those near him cried out, others were made mute by the sight. For an instant, his eyes were not his own, and a cold passed along the bone under his ribs as if something had been wrenched there. Geralt smelled iron and something stranger, an odor like the inside of a sealed tomb, salted and old. He knelt before Frodo, as he had knelt before men and beasts that had taken the worst of steel. The wound was small at the skin, but told a long tale in the silence it kept. He could not see the shard, but he knew what lay within, a shard of that poisoned craft, a scrap of the ring-wraith's malice, meant to crawl slow and become one with the bearer. He also knew, in the same certainty with which a hunter knows a trail, that Rivendell lay too far. The road would not keep what the Morgul blade had begun to stitch into flesh. He did the work of a witcher then because no other hand was fit and because there was not time for prayer. From his pouch he drew a brown vial wrapped in oilskin. The glass caught, and through the wild firelight, the draught within was not a common herb brew. Witcher draughts are quick knives in a bottle, mutagen and root harshly blended, the sap of wolfsbane boiled down to bitter amber, a tincture that steadied breath and inked the blood with strange resolve. Geralt's thumb found the stopper as his other hand touched Frodo's pulse. He looked at the little face, more weary than old, and made a decision as sharp as any blade. "Hold him," he said, and his voice was not soft. It had the shape of command, but not the cruelty of a master. Hands came, rough and small. Someone murmured a name that turned like a pebble in his mouth. Geralt tipped the vial. Frodo took it like a child taking medicine, and then coughed, and the draught went to work like cold pouring out of a room. It warmed in the belly first, like embers being coaxed in wet wood. The pail that had been taking the hobbit remitted a shade, and his breath steadied to a regular measure as if a bell had been given a new clapper. The magic of the Yrden kept the wraiths at bay. Geralt had stacked signs and steel and scent together like traps, and for the moment they held. A Nazgul shrieked into the night and beat the air with wings that made the very light tremble. From the edge of the circle, its shadow tossed a thin hand the thing sought with the persistence of cold. Geralt braced his back against stone, the set of his jaw another for it. He felt the draught working in the hobbit's blood as a hand feels for a pulse. Quick, clinical, fated. Yet the witcher's tincture was not a cure but a jail. It drew its power by a tether, a pact of use and cost. Geralt watched Frodo's eyes as the potion moved through him. They cleared, but with that clarity came a glassness at the edges, as if the light reached through too far and found no soul behind it for a second. Frodo blinked and then saw, briefly, ghosts that were not outside, but inside the cup of his skull. Mountain slopes of shadow, a crown of iron, the ring like a distant sun. He clutched at the memory and the ring like two halves of the same hunger. The draught steadied the wound's pacing. He could feel the Morgul's hunger slow, like a river forced into a narrower channel. But as the blade's urgency lessened, another thing unlatched itself. A quiet, clinging debt. Witcher potions settle into the frame and mark the soul's edges. They are not only medicine, but agreement. A man who takes them owes a measure of his steadiness back to the brewer's craft. It is not always a matter of chains or speech. It is subtler, a taste that returns, a craving for the steadiness when fear comes, a lean of the will toward the hand that gives the draught. Geralt had seen this in his own kindred and on men who had not been of his blood, and he had not the vanity to pretend it unfamiliar. Frodo did not speak of that then. He lay low and breathing, and his small hands twitched as if in response to some internal music. The ring on his finger caught the wild firelight and threw it back green and terrible. It was as if the draft had settled between them, an unspoken ledger. Geralt pressed his palm to the hobbit's brow. His fingers came away with dust, with the smell of the road. He felt responsibility land like iron upon his shoulders. He had steadied the body, yes, but he had also bound the soul a little to Witcher's craft. That knot would have to be tended. Whether it could be loosened at all, he did not know. Around them, people moved with the slow, sure panic of those who must not lose heart. Someone bound Frodo's wound with rough linen, and the sting of cloth against heated skin brought a flush to his cheeks. The Nazgul wheeled, and their shadows fell like curtains across the moon. The Yrden held, but its light was thin and could not be everywhere. Geralt rose, his sword heavy in its hand, and in that motion it was as if the path under his boots became a vow. He did not speak of fate. He had no time for prophecies. He had time for tasks. There are judgments that men make with their hands, not their tongues. Geralt made one now. He would keep watch by the hobbit. He would carry him if the road demanded it. He would buy each hour with sweat and steel, rather than lay the creature down to die slowly and make of him a thing for the Nazgul to take. In the Witcher's life, there had been a thin book of promises he carried inside his chest, dog-eared and stained. He had turned a page for many a stranger. This page now was filled with a different ink, a debt owed in the name of mercy. Yet he knew there would be more to pay. The Morgul shard, even slowed, did not stop. It sent a slow, malicious cold toward the heart. The draft made that road longer, but did not raise it. Rivendell might save Frodo Elrond, might take the blade scrap and draw it out by craft older than Witcher's, but they were far. The Black Riders would not rest in their pursuit. They had felt anew a hunter among prey, and the scent would keep them ravenous. Geralt glanced at the ring and then at the horizon, where a smear of red light marked the place where the Nazgul had come from. He felt, absurd and stubborn, the tug of duty to a world not his own. He had not sought the ring, nor asked to be named in any fellowship. Yet the world presses small men into large things without asking, and a Witcher is good at the work of pressing back. He turned his head and spoke, not for declaration, but for the sake of moving people to act. "We move," he said. His voice was the steady thing the draft had bought, slow and undercover. "Keep to the trees where you can. I will take the road the Nazgul do not watch. They obeyed as men obey when lives hang on them like fruit on a branch." Frodo's hand found Geralt's sleeve and closed it, held as if to anchor himself to this new steadiness. For a heartbeat, their hands were two different kinds of weather, the Witcher's, cold and calloused, and the Hobbit's, fraying but warm. There is an intimacy in such contact that needs no words. Geralt felt the ring's presence shift under his gaze, felt the small panic like a new weather in the place where his heart would have been had he been freer to keep one. As they set out, the signs of pursuit tightened. A Nazgul passed above, its voice a thing of rusted bells. Down the lane, a horse screamed, and the sound made the night reel. The Yrden glowed low behind them, an ember that would not last. Geralt kept his blade. Sheathed steel draws attention as much as it slices. He kept close to Frodo and thought, in the simple, manly fashion of those born to keep watch, of a list of tasks to be done before dawn. Find shelter. See to the wound. Keep the hobbit's mind from fracturing, and harbor the knowledge that each dose of that bitter draught would ask for more of him than the last. He had given medicine, and in giving had made a ledger. In the silence between hoofbeats, he knew that the ledger would be paid in steps, not coin. The road would demand them both. Steps toward Rivendell, toward mercy, and perhaps toward a cure. Yet the road might equally take them into deeper shadow, where the Nazgul's cold could find purchase again, or where the ring itself would see the new susceptibility and shape its temptations accordingly. Geralt walked then with Frodo apace within the circle of those who would not let their lights go out. The Witcher felt the draught's aftertaste upon his tongue as if he had tasted his own remedy. It was bitter and metallic and had the memory of iron and winter. He told himself that some debts were less onerous than death. He also told himself that there may be ways yet unthought to cut a debt's cords. He did not know which of these thoughts was the truer. As the trees swallowed them, the Nazgul's shadow thinned at the edges, like a wound that could not be seen from the inside. Geralt kept his hand near his belt, and for an instant his fingers closed around the haft of his sword as if to feel the certainty of steel beneath skin. He had bent a life around the price of survival. He had taken up another's fate because it was there to be taken. The draft had bought time. Yes, it had also bought obligation. He walked on because walking was what he knew to do next, because obligation is a thing that demands answer, and because there were powers abroad that would turn any mercy into a snare if given leave. The night closed like a palm behind them, and ahead lay a road that would not yield its end without a reckoning. When the gray that had been Gandalf vanished into stone and flame, the world did not so much shudder as fall quiet, as if some great bell had been removed from the cathedral of the earth and left its hollow behind. Dust drifted like an ashen snow, settling in the grooves of carved bench and shield, in the ruffles of cloak. The light itself seemed smaller, robbed of counsel and of fire. Men and elves and dwarves bent their heads not only out of grief, but from the need to hear their own hearts again, to find a rhythm that the loss had not stolen. Geralt stood with his hands still out, fingers cramped where he had tried to lay them upon the gray staff. For a heartbeat, he mistook the cadence of the air as a thing to be read, as a witcher reads the rattle in a cave or the tremor beneath packed earth. But there is no teaching for a grief like this. He had seen death 100 ways, by blade, by bite, by hunger, by the slow rot of age. But the falling of a pillar is a different hurt. The world named a protector, and then said he was gone. Aragorn made no sound for a long time, as if he were listening for a voice that might rise again. Legolas' hands were steady on his bow, though his eyes were wet. Gimli's beard trembled and spat a curse, and then he pressed his head against the stone and did not speak the name. Boromir did not bow. His face had gone hard, like iron left too long at a forge. Where others held to remembrance, his mind had already leapt toward practical things. What had been lost, what might yet be taken. "You should have let him go," Boromir said then, not a plea, but a blade. His voice cut across the hush and the dust like a thrown spear. "You clung to counsel and to lore. Our hour waits for no counsel. Gondor bleeds, and we stand here mourning while shadows gather." Geralt answered only with the dry rasp of a man who had seen too many men leap to accusation when fear had its teeth in them. He remembered the moment when the Balrog had risen, remembered the fire-warped scales, the whip that struck as if the air were a thing to be torn. He remembered bending words and will, the pulling of wind with a gesture older than the first sword, the coldness that had come after heat. He had done what he could with signs and tinctures whose names the Rohirrim would never speak in the public places. He had taken a hobbit in shaken hands and given him draughts to staunch nausea and a salve to close a wound that smelled of sulfur and ash. He had not fought the Balrog with incantation alone. He had tried, and he had failed. But you treated the ring-bearer, Boromir went on, eyes narrowing until they were slits of accusation. You meddled with him. A witcher gives elixirs that change men. You altered the hobbit to make him strong when he should have been weak before us. Who are you to decide what he needs? The words landed in the hollow place between the stone pillars and took root like a bitter seed. Accusations grew as if watered by each man's private dread. Legolas' face was a leaf stirred. Aragorn's jaw tightened to a line that could not be smoothed. Frodo, pale beneath the hood, pressed a small hand to his mouth and looked as if the world had rearranged itself into a set of uses, and he was the most dangerous of tools. It was I who chose him, Aragorn said, and the words were an oath and a rebuke. We all made the choice. None may alter the course with quiet poisons or secret arts. Secret arts? Geralt's voice was flat. He did not give names where names would inflame. There are, in his craft, potions that sharpen the eye and ones that dull the tremor of the stomach. There are tinctures that steady the heart and others that call the strength from bone at a terrible cost. He had used but a single draught, bitter and thin, to keep Frodo from fainting when the steps had shivered, and a salve to seal a scorch that smoked like a candle guttering. He offered no flourish, only the truth as clean and austere as a blade. Frodo's eyes, when they found Geralt's, were fathoms deep but not clear. I remember nothing, he said. His voice was a small harp not yet plucked. I remember only the heat and a shape. I heard a voice that called me by another name, and then there was cold. He looked down at his hands as if they were someone else's. He touched me, and then I dreamed of a road that would take me alone. Boromir's world narrowed to that one fear: lose the ring, lose Gondor. His fingers curled on the hilt of his sword, not reaching for steel now, but for argument as if it were a weapon. A witcher meddles and men are divided, he said. If you can alter a hobbit, you can alter his will. What holds us together then? If the ring must be borne by trust, who will trust a man who poisons counsel? There was a murmur then, the beginning of a fracture. Small voices took the shape of suspicion. An elf remembered tales of witchcraft that had nothing to do with Geralt, names told over slow fires. A dwarf spat and said there was no use in being wise if you could not show your face. Samwise, who had been standing near and had not yet spoken, put himself between Frodo and Boromir with a stoutness that should not be measured for much, but for its stubborn courage. You stay away from him, Sam said, his voice sharp as a coin. You keep your counsel. I knows what I saw. You didn't touch my master's hand. Boromir's reply was a snarl, almost lost in the cascade of old grief and new fear. You are the servants of strangers, he said, each letter a stone thrown. You would see Gondor starve for the sake of your curiosities. I will take counsel that saves my people. At that, the world tilted. Words became deeds with a speed that surprised them all. Boromir reached for Frodo, an attempt to seize what he thought could save his city. Frodo moved back as if the ring itself had pushed him. In his retreat, the hobbit's cloak caught on a broken staple of carved stone and tore. The little hand that had once been sure on a needle now trembled with the knowledge of weight. Aragorn stepped forward to intercept, to hold the peace, while Legolas vanished like a shadow toward Boromir's flank. Gimli swung an axe, but neither landed nor was meant to. The clamor was for order rather than blood. Geralt watched and measured. If Boromir had moved to take the ring by force, a man of his strength and station might have taken it. Then what would be the world? Who would be left to choose? Geralt felt in this place that his presence might be the fulcrum. He had not been born into oaths of men and elves. He had been given a trade, and with it a solitude that severed tenderness from decision. Yet he had sworn other bonds in his life, brief things, shifting as smoke, but oaths all the same. He remembered the hut in Kaer Morhen, where old men taught him to read the wind. He remembered walking alone between ruined towns and seeing men look away. He remembered a young witcher from his keep who had once said, with the frankness of youth, that to be of service to another man is to be alive. A promise had been given to Aragorn upon a road and had been kept in a way that needed no spoken seal. He felt the weight of it now as an actual press against his chest. Frodo stood in the center of this turning tide as if the world had shrunk to the size of the ring he bore. He did not look like a vessel to be bargained with. He looked like a child forced to hold up an entire storm. "I will go alone," he whispered. Finally, the words were not command, but offering, the way one offers a coin to a beggar and hopes he will refuse. "I will go where I must. You have all been," he swallowed, "you have all been kind, but I cannot lead you to fire." There was a silence, and in it the very stones seemed to decide. Aragorn took a step forward, meaning to speak, to argue, to call duty and brotherhood into being like a shelter. Boromir's eyes glittered with a feverish grief that had converted to desire. "You cannot go alone," he said, the sound broken. "You would doom us." Frodo's decision came in the smallest of movements. He stepped back, and then sideways, and then he was moving like one who is learning to walk in a dream. The little hobbit turned his face toward a shadowed corridor, toward the soft green stain of outer world beyond the carved halls where moonlight gathered in pools. Sam blinked and lunged to follow, but Aragorn laid a hand on Sam's shoulder and held him, as if to spare him from a rashness that might break both of them. Geralt's choice unclenched like a caught net. He could remain and argue with Boromir and Aragorn until swords were drawn or words worn thin. He could stand with a fellowship that still bore the names and oaths of elder days, fight beside men whose faces were familiar and whose cause was clear. There was honor in that path. He felt it tug at a place beneath the ribs where old loyalties sat like embers. Yet another path lay taut as wire in the dim, a thread that led after a small, hurried shape into the night. He knew that to shadow a ring-bearer required more than presence. It required secrecy, solitude, a willingness to be unseen and to be hated for unseen reasons. Witchers are trained in walking in the dark between worlds. He looked at Frodo once more. The hobbit's shoulders were trembling, but his shoulders were set. Sam's hand rested like a warm stone on Frodo's elbow. The rest of the company gathered into small knots of talk and accusation, voices rising and falling like wind among branches. Geralt felt the old, hollowing solitude call to him like an old wolf's howl. There are moments when a man must break one oath to keep another. The Witcher knew each oath he had ever spoken had always been paid in solitude. His hand closed on the hilt at his hip, not in preparation to draw, but to steady himself. The sound of his own breathing was a metronome in the vastness. He had offered help in halls of kings, and in low inns he had kept silent vigils over fevered beds where mothers had wept. He had never sought to bend a will to his own. He had only sought to hold the fragile against the crush of greater things. He stepped away from the knot of arguing faces and toward the shadowed arch through which Frodo had vanished. No one called after him at first. Then Sam, with a voice thick and raw, said, "Mr. Frodo," as if to will him back. Frodo paused, and for the length of a heartbeat looked like the hobbit who had once laughed at his own feet. He did not turn. Geralt's boots made no sound on the flagstone. He moved as a thing who knows how to be unseen, but not because he wished to hide. He moved because the choice had been made. He left behind the clamor of claims and the sound of men arranging the cost of grief. He left behind the promise of standing shoulder to shoulder with those who bore names and banners. He went instead to trail the hobbit into the green-leaning dark, to be a shadow that would not seek glory, but might yet earn trust by watching the smallest of steps. As he passed beneath the arch, he felt the night lift, felt a different kind of weight take him like a cloak. The ring's voice did not speak, yet its whisper would come later, a patient, honeyed thing. For now there was only the scent of moss and the soft brush of leaves against a cloak. Geralt kept his eyes low and his senses higher, tasting the air for the tang of smoke and the faint metallic pulse that might betray the great eye's reach. He had chosen to follow, and in that choosing something else turned in the heart of the fellowship. Behind him, voices rose and fell, setting themselves like stones along a new road. Boromir's accusations lingered in the carved spaces like spattered oil on white marble. Aragorn's hands tremor told of a man not yet ready to let go. The fellowship, as it had been, had unraveled in the span of a breath. Ahead, the path wound like a seam through dark and green, and a small footfall beat a lonely rhythm. Geralt stepped quicker, not to overtake, but to stay within reach, his coat catching the moonlight now and then like a pale mark on the earth. The choice had been made. Now, the doing would be its own crucible. The air at the throat of Orodruin was a living thing. It pressed and burned and smelled of iron and old grief. Heat crawled across faces like an accusing hand. Frodo stood on the rim of stone and smoke, small in a world that had been made to swallow small things, and the ring burned in his grasp, a sun in miniature promising everything and doom in one polished whisper. Around him, the fellowship was a ring of light, every face taut with the terrible certainty that the moment had come. The world narrowed to the glow of molten rock and the rasp of a single hateful hunger. Gollum returned to them as a thing made from gaps and hunger. He ran, no more than a shadow in the glare, slipping and sliding on the black loam, the wetness of him catching ember light like a second heart. He reached Frodo with a wet little cry, two sounds, pleading and feral, and lunged. The air held its breath. For an instant, all reasons lined up like arrows aimed at a single bullseye. The ring could have been taken, worn, used strategy and sorrow, and the blunt calculus of war whispered that a weapon of such craft could be turned if one dared to be cruel enough. Geralt felt those whispers, felt the cold calculus of a life honed to practicality, and felt firmer, something older than appetite. He did not seize it. Instead, he stepped closer in a way that moved through noise like a blade through cloth. His hand was steady and not unkind when it found Frodo's wrist. The little hobbit trembled under his fingers like a leaf caught in a flame. The Witcher's voice, low, graveled by foreign winters, said nothing lofty. It was a word to steady breathing, a syllable from a language not of this land, but of craft and survival. He used the sign axii, a pulse of will that slid between thinking and feeling, not to bend Frodo into a thing he would not be, but to break a loop, to give a mind already stretched thin a sliver of fresh air. Axii is not mercy by law, and Geralt knew the name of the sin as clearly as the price. He knew the shape of compulsion, its shadow on the soul. He chose it because all other tools were blunt and bloody. He chose it for a moment, a crack in the dark, a borrowed clarity. Frodo's fingers, which had clung as if iron-bound, loosened. For a heartbeat, he seemed to look at the ring as if seeing the wooden floor of his uncle's kitchen and the smell of baking bread. Sam cried out, a small human sound that was almost an animal note, and reached Sam's hand, brushed Frodo's shoulder, found steadiness. Geralt felt the witch's sign wear through him like a thin frost. Magic always carves at the one who uses it, and Axii takes a ledger from both the giver and the given. He felt a faint shiver, a pulling at the edges of his awareness, as if a small part of his own steadiness had been left in the hobbit's eyes. "Do it," he whispered. Not a command, but a keening plea without words, not to one voice, but to the thin human place beneath the ring's glare. Frodo moved. It was quiet, almost private. He held the ring out over the churning throat, and for a slow, terrible beat, it trembled in its own light. Gollum crawled up again, nimble in his madness, hands like claws on slick rock. He bit, a frenzy of broken teeth and holy theft. He seized the finger, Frodo had it still, and tore. Flesh and ring and old promises came apart in a small, intimate ruin. Gollum laughed, high and doomed, and fell backwards. They watched the dance of a thing returning to its element. The ring slipped from the grasp of blooded hands and caught the air for an instant before the world took it. The black mouth of the mountain opened, and the golden circle slid into fire, and the light went out. There was no triumphant shout from the stone. There was a keening, a long exhalation from the earth, and something like a small mercy in the silence that followed. But salvation was not without its rents. Frodo screamed once, a sound that was less of pain than of a soul undone and mended by hands too clumsy for such work. Sam cradled him, as if shelter could still be built from another's ribs. His face was mud and tears and the fierce, unquenchable loyalty of a gardener. Aragorn knelt with a sword across his lap, speech caught in a throat that had seen a crown promised by blood. Gandalf stood, and there was ache in his eyes as if the world had been measured in measures he could not forgive himself for missing. Frodo's hand was a ruin. He had lost the finger, and with it some small anchor of his life. But worse lay inward. Where Axii had slid in as a clearing wind, it left a shape. Compulsion, even when applied gently, writes in the mind as a graft leaves a scar. Frodo's inner country, once rich with shire hedgerows and summer memories, now bore a new architecture. Thin corridors where someone else's intent had passed, rooms with doors that had been opened from the outside. He would carry that at night, long after the news of victory had been eaten into song. There would be a hush in him where the signs whisper sat like an unauthorized guest. He would remember the peace it gave him, the clarity that let him let the ring go. And he would remember it as invasion. Both truths lived in him. Reconciliation would be slow and brittle, as rethatching a ruined roof. The fellowship bore wounds no blade could stitch. There were looks exchanged that were not leveled with words. Sam's grief had edges of accusation, and Aragorn's gratitude was threaded with a quiet, hard question. Gandalf's face held the old sorrow of one who counts prices and sees them being paid. Even Merry and Pippin, their small faces slate still, carried pearls of fear. Now, what faith once easy for hobbit hearts had been complicated by sight of the means to an end. They had stood together and lost the world for a while and found it again, but they had also learned that salvation could be a dark trade. Geralt felt all of this as if he were looking through glass. He tasted ash as if it were salt. On his tongue, he had refused the ring. He had not seized dominion when dominion begged to be taken by a hand accustomed to making hard choices. He had given up power for a moment of grace and paid a different price. The knowledge that to bend another's will, however lightly, lodged a weight in the soul that does not buff away. He had changed the shape of a life in order to spare the world he could not be certain the trade was his to make. That uncertainty sat like a stone in his gut. When the mountain shuddered and the sky tore, when the air was full of the rebuke of a power undone, they stumbled from the throat and down scorched slopes. Ash fell like gray snow. Men wept without sound. The fires began to die in the distance, and with every cooling breath, the small things of the world, blades of grass, splintered branches, a child's toy somewhere in a shire not yet fully known, waited for the sun to be different again. In the days that followed, words attempted to stitch the new order. There were speeches and embraces and a morning when the sun came up and looked like itself, as if it had been frightened back into place. Frodo moved among them, and he smiled again, and sometimes he drifted to a place no one could touch and came back with tears in his eyes. He asked Sam to write down small things to remember, the angle of light in their pantry, the taste of a seed cake, the sound of a river. Sam did so with hand trembling, and in those lists were found the first braces for healing. Geralt kept his distance. He was not asked to stand in councils. His place had been in those shadows. He did not belong to the laughter that new rule invited. People thanked him in many ways. They clasped his bloodied hand. They bowed heads. But some gratitude had an astringent undertone like quicksilver. A few whispered they said the Witcher had been a necessary evil. Others simply said nothing, looking instead at the hobbit who had given things up, and at the man whose trade had been to slay beasts, now seen as one who had used the very art he had renounced. He tended to injuries only as a craftsman tends a tool. He cleaned wounds, bound fingers that would not grow back, set bone in a shoulder, all with the precise measures of a man who had long ago learned the geometry of pain. But when he knelt beside Frodo on a morning washed with rain, and the sun tried its patience on the air, there was no skill left to sew what had been touched inside. Frodo turned to him and asked, in a small voice, not what was done, but why. Geralt could have lied. He could have said fate, duty, the common good. Instead, he said something blunt and true, that sometimes the shape of mercy is ugly, and sometimes men must make a hard choice. Frodo listened like one who had read 100 maps and found them all bent. He said nothing else then, only took from his pocket the list Sam had made and folded it into the Witcher's palm, an offering not of thanks, but of trust. The small paper burned now with a sentimental tenderness that Geralt, who had few uses for sentiment, felt like a thing he had no right to hold. He kept the list. He would not become a storyman, could not be pressed into the role of legend. He would carry that paper as an anchor to the fact that he had been chosen not by kings or by fate, but by a hobbit with a clarity carved from cunning and pain. The world would mend, though in places it would mend strangely. Gardens would be replanted and songs written. A king would be crowned and walk a road heavy with promise. Yet, in the quiet hours under a sky that now remembered starlight, the fellowship would find that some wounds curled inward. Compassion was a currency that left ledgers the balance was different for every soul. Some grew swifter, others learned the brittle skill of forgiveness. None were untouched. Geralt left as quietly as one who knows a door should be closed behind him. He walked away from the great roads and the songs, stepping at first on paths of blackened stone, and then into ridges of land where smoke still curled. He did not look back at the little inn where the other survivors stooped to eat. He had no craving for tavern warmth. He walked because the road remained the only honest place for him to reckon with what he had done. The witching trade had taught him to move. When his conscience crowded him, wandering was both penance and method. At the edge of the world they had saved, he lingered long enough to feel the change of air. A gull wheeled somewhere over a distant sea and cried like a single sharp complaint. He folded the paper from Frodo into his coat and felt the slight weight of a hobbit's remembered bread inside. He had refused power and used compulsion. He had saved a world and remade the cost of being saved. That knowledge settled in him not as answer, but as direction. He walked toward the wastes where monsters might rip and villages needed a blade. He walked with the slow certainty of a man whose hands had done one last kindness, and who now owed the world an accountant he would meet in miles. Behind him, life would rebuild, and songs would center on the small, bright act of a hobbit and the tragic laugh of a creature named Gollum. Ahead, the road was long, and the Witcher, who had learned a new mercy, took one foot in front of the other, not fleeing judgment, but seeking a place where he might understand whether mercy forced by will could ever be properly healed.